Hello. Another week goes by, another week of lockdown. I hope you're okay. Baruch Hashem, we had the bris for our baby. He's called Naftali. Naftali was my grandfather, my mother's father, an amazing person who survived the Holocaust and came to this country and rebuilt his family into a beautiful, large Jewish family. And we hope our son Naftali emulates these great qualities that my grandfather had. So we just read in the Seder of Yisrael last week the Ten Commandments, the story of the giving of the Torah, how it was given with great fanfare, lightning, thunder, and how the people were gathered at the mountain. We can just picture an incredible scene. And then we move to this Seder Mishpatim. We go from the sublime to the mundane. To Ve'ele, Rashi says, Ve'ele, and these, means these are also given at Sinai, these laws, these judgments. What happens if you damage somebody's car? What happens if somebody steals? How to run a civil and just society. And we understand, because for all these great moments we have in life, these great moments of inspiration, we also have to cater for the times that things go a bit pear-shaped, that people do the wrong thing and get lost and lose their way. But what's intriguing is the very first topic of the Seder Mishpatim is the subject of an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, because in those times, if somebody couldn't pay something they'd stolen or they owed money and they wanted to raise money, they could sell themselves as a slave, or today we'd use the word servant, as we'll see. And they would have to work for 6 years, and after that they'd go free, and they'd either have paid off their debts or been rehabilitated from their stealing. But why start with that? I mean, these people, this nation, had just spent 200 years in slavery. Surely forcing one of their own to be a slave would be the last thing they were thinking of. Why start with slavery? So there's an interesting story told a number of years ago when they were bringing over the first Olim, the first immigrants to Israel from Yemen. So these were people who'd grown up in little villages, who didn't understand, had no idea of the modern technology of the modern world. And there's a story of a little Yemenite called him Moshe, and his cousin sends him a ticket to come and join him in Israel. He's very excited, but when he gets to the airport, the whole thing is a blur. He's metal staircases and these big roaring engines, and he's completely shocked. Eventually he gets to Israel, and his cousin Moshe realizes that he's going to struggle, so he organizes somebody to pick him up from the airport, and he lives in a little moshav near Lod, near the airport. So the taxi driver drops him off. He says, just follow the train track for a few hundred meters, and you'll find it. So he walks along the train track, and suddenly this big monster starts coming towards him, making a noise. And it starts making this big honking noise. And he's no idea what the problem is. He's never seen such a thing before. And just at the last second, he realizes he better get out of the way. And he jumps out the way of the train track. And he survives. And eventually he gathers himself together. And he comes into the village. And he meets his cousin. And he's very excited. And his cousin says, come in, sit down. I'll make you a cup of tea. Tell me how you're doing. So he makes a cup of tea, an old-fashioned kettle. And after a couple of minutes, the kettle starts making this whistling. And the fellow gets in a panic. And he takes a stick and he smashes the kettle. His cousin says, what are you doing? He says, I know these monsters. You've got to get them when they're young. And of course, the nimshal, the understanding of the parable is that sometimes if a person has a negative experience of something, they turn completely against it, irrationally against it. And we could have had that attitude towards the Torah's concept of slavery. But what is the Torah's concept of slavery? It's that if a person needs to be rehabilitated, if a person needs to pay their debt so that they can have a clear conscience and start again, or pay back what they stole so they can clear their name, then they could sell their work. They could sell themselves. Today we call it an employee or a servant. But in those days we refer to it as, Torah calls it an Eved Ivri, a type of slavery. But it wasn't a slavery where they were in chains and just given enough food to survive. We're told if the owner has only one pillow, he has to give it to his slave. He's not allowed to ask his slave to do menial work, things that he wouldn't do himself. So the Torah is telling us that this world is imperfect, and sometimes there can be imperfect situations. Sometimes people need to be able to pay off their debts. Some religions refuse to recognize that things can go wrong. In some religions, you can't get divorced. But the Torah is telling us no, sometimes we have to be able to sort things out and start again. In today's society, if you're stolen from, you're lucky if you ever see a penny of the money. You're lucky if a fraudster is ever caught. But in the time of the Jewish world, where we had this concept of Eved Ivri, this was how people were rehabilitated, because only the good people, only the righteous people would want to try and show somebody at their own expense a better way. And that way, the Torah is showing us that we can change, we can turn someone's round and make something imperfect into something much, much better. Wish you all a good Shabbos.